psychedelic assisted therapy. So today we're going to have a little bit of a longer episode. We're going to be talking about all things mental health. And we have a mental health crisis going on in the United States. So we're going to talk about dismantling the current mental health paradigm and introducing the mind-body model, which is critically important. We're going to talk about pros and cons of conventional therapy. They do have pros, but they do have quite a few cons as well. And then what are these new breakthrough treatments, and what are their pros and cons? Because they also have pros and cons like everything else in life. And so I'll let Ryan introduce himself. Ryan?
I'm Ryan Phillips, naturopathic doctor. I'm also a board-certified biofeedback therapist and currently working on my certification in psychedelic-assisted therapy with the Integrative Psychiatry Institute.
Yeah, okay, Integrative Psychiatry Institute. And just for our guests, because I think it's important for people to understand political orientation to things, so you're getting a certification, and right now in Colorado we have a bill that's kind of working its way through into policy potentially called the Natural Medicines Bill.
So the Natural Medicines Health Act that was originally Proposition 122, which was voted into law in November of 22.
Okay.
The personal and communal use portions of that law came into effect January of 23.
Okay.
But right now it is in committee where we're developing the rules for licensure for clinical facilitators, growers of natural psychedelics, licensure for people who are going to be selling that. Mm-hmm. So all that framework is still developing. So we're in this gray zone where part of the law has been implemented, right, but the other part of the law, the clinical portion of the law and the commercial portion of the law, is taking shape over this year and will be in effect by the end of 2024.
Okay, so they're figuring out the logistical piece of it and how do we make it safe, basically.
Yeah, what does it look like? I mean, the personal use portion is already wide open, but then there's a lot of effort to make sure that this bill is different than the bill that legalized cannabis in Colorado, that this isn't going to be a recreational model. This is going to be a personal use, but then also a clinical model as well.
Okay, so there's not going to be like a magic mushroom shop. You can just go down and pick up this, that, or the other variety.
It doesn't look like that's going to be the case right now. And even if there is, it's going to be quite different. It will probably be more similar to the medical marijuana model that you see in some states, but that's still all filtering down.
Okay, all right. So like the reason I think it's important for people to understand policy is there's pros and cons to that too.
Yeah.
But also it makes it a little more accessible for people that are hesitant or the kind of reefer madness generation that thinks like psychedelics are just gonna your brain on drugs and it's a fried egg in a pan, right? Kind of trying to break down some of these negative stereotypes we have.
Yeah, and there's a difference, there's a lot of confusion here on this topic with the law, because there's the concept of decriminalization, then there's legalization, and then there's actual laws for clinical application as well. Right. And so we've seen decrim movements. Actually, Denver started out with the first decrim of psilocybin mushrooms in 2019, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm. I think it was the first city to do it, right?
First
or maybe
city.
Someplace in California was also right there.
Right, and decriminalization is not legalization. Decriminalization just means that even though this is still illegal, it's not going to be enforced.
Right, if you get caught, speeding and they patch it down and you have a bag of mushrooms, you're fine, as long as you're not high on mushrooms.
Yeah, exactly, right. And then the first state to take action was Oregon with measures 109 and 110, which was both a decrim/legalization bill that decriminalized a lot of substances, but also set up a clinical model for use of psychedelics in therapy. Our model here in Colorado with the Natural Medicines Health Act is actually much more expansive than the Oregon law, and it really is the first really robust piece of legislation legalizing natural psychedelics and other natural medicines for mental health therapy.
Fantastic. So we should talk about the kind of conventional approach to mental health. As someone that has personally experienced this and was told when I was a teenager, you're going to have anxiety and panic attacks and depression for the rest of your life. There's nothing you can do about it. Very much like taking away my power, or at least the way that I interpreted my psychiatrist's conversation with me. You have something chemically wrong with your brain. And I did not accept that. And not everybody accepts that. I have patients that see me and they're like, yeah, but my doctor told me. And like,
Yeah.
that's it. Like, they're just like, okay, we're done. So what is, in your experience, because you're kind of the specialist here and I'm just a family medicine doc and I kind of have enough fingers in the pie to understand it, but also, you know, I'm curious what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, and I guess when I introduced myself earlier, I didn't kind of fully go into some of my background. I've been in practice for about 3.5 years, and my focus is on integrative mental health. And I've worked in multiple different settings already, in teams of counselors, in a neurological rehabilitation center where I was the assistant clinical director, and in another naturopathic clinic. But in all those settings, my focus has been on what's called integrative mental health. And integrative mental health takes the best of both the conventional model and also alternative, complementary models, whatever you want to label them, holistic, which we could get into a whole discussion about what each of those terms mean as well.
I like to call it traditional medicine, but people get confused because they call medical doctors traditional medicine, which kind of peeves me up a little bit.
Yeah, it's conventional medicine.
It's conventional medicine or allopathic medicine. It is not the same.
I agree. Traditional medicine, we can't use that term because there are traditional world medicines like Ayurveda and Chinese medicine that have been around for thousands of years.
There's so many of them. And like we barely even scratch the surface because a lot of those people had oral traditions of passing down medicines and healing from, generation to generation.
Right. So when I use the term integrative mental health, I mean taking the best of both the conventional modern medical model, but then also other systems and more traditional or alternative systems, and using them in combination to produce the greatest and safest effect.
So what do you think about the whole, like, well, your brain is just chemically imbalanced, there's nothing you can do about it?
Well, that's one piece, right? It's one piece of the picture, but it's not the whole picture.
What does that even mean, though, like chemical imbalance? Like, we were kind of chatting last night about one of your cases, and so I'm, from that perspective, there is like some biochemical individuality that does play a role.
There is, absolutely. So let's use the example of ADHD or ADD. So most of the people who have ADD or ADHD oftentimes have a genetic predisposition to certain aberrations, especially like in their dopamine synthesis, transport, and metabolism pathways.
And what does dopamine help us do?
So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that really is about motivation and reward.
Okay.
Okay, so if you do not produce dopamine at the same level that most other people produce it at, or you have difficulty transporting it, or you have aberrations in the receptors that respond to it.
And aberrations is like breakdown, like the system doesn't like translate the way that like we would expect it to.
I mean, aberrations, I guess in this case, would be like, quote unquote, bad genes that negatively affect that. But even that definition of describing a gene as a bad gene, I really don't like to use that.
It's inaccurate because it's not taking into consideration epigenetics.
Yes, and not only that, it doesn't take into the fact that there is neurological diversity, and neurological diversity actually was an advantageous trait for us to have.
Absolutely.
During our evolutionary development. So a lot of traits that we consider, bad genes, now it's not that they're bad, it's just that they don't serve us well in our current context that we live in, that we did not evolve to be in.
Right, it's like Albert Einstein's quote, like, tell a fish to climb a tree and they're going to be dumb. It's like, okay, fish don't climb trees, but they can swim.
Exactly, and so a lot of the people who actually get diagnosed with ADD or ADHD, they are neurodivergent, but they're neurodivergent in a way that once was advantageous. Right? They were the members of society who went out to search new areas for berries. They went to find new hunting grounds. They had to seek out stronger stimuli and novelty to get that same dopamine response, right? Which back in the days when we were hunters and gatherers, they were the explorers, they were the pioneers, they were probably the warriors as well, right? But now that we live in this world, that impulsivity, and exploration and, even risk-seeking behavior is not advantageous, but actually gets socially punished, those people are considered to have a disorder.
Right. And
pause for a second. Can you take your necklace off? It's hitting the mic.
yeah, okay, this happened last time too.
Sorry.
Thank you.
I'll go ahead and restart it, and I'll give you a countdown.
So not advantageous, but I feel like I saw a case of like a person that was choosing to go unmedicated for their ADHD, and I can't remember if they were like in a tech setting or what it was, but they were having to do like multiple different activities in a single day. Like they were having to like be really on top of things. And I can kind of think like, okay, Wolf on Wall Street, I don't know if you ever saw that movie.
I know about it.
Or it's like those guys were using a lot of stimulants to be on Wall Street and like be checking the stocks and doing all these things and like, oh my God, we lost the money. And like, I kind of think about people that have that neurodivergent quality of what we refer to as ADD or ADHD. They would probably thrive in those environments because you kind of got to be constantly on.
Exactly, yeah. And, you know, it's not that it's necessarily even a disease or a disorder, but it is a adaptive trait that is not well suited to the environment we now live in, is the way I think about it.
For sure. Sit down and be quiet for 8 hours a day.
And so, to go back to your original question, yes, there is a biochemical difference for those individuals. The amount of stimuli it takes for them to get a dopamine response, the type of dopamine response they have, and you can see that actually in genetic testing, right? The problem that comes in is that we think that the changes in their neurotransmitter synthesis and pathways are the only thing to blame.
Right.
Right, and that's just one piece of a very complex puzzle. This is true for ADD, ADHD, it's true for depression, anxiety, so many different conditions. And, you know, through a biomedical lens, we're only looking at, you know, the movement and interaction of matter and space. And we are more than just biological machines. Right, we have a mind, right? And mind is different than brain. And then we also have a spirit as well. And obviously there's not a lot of agreement on what that means, but I know what I mean whenever I use that term. And so when we don't take into account these other factors along with the biological realities, we're not treating the whole person. We're just treating their parts.
Right.
Yeah.
Psychiatrist, cardiologist, gastroenterologist, and none of those people talk to each other. So that's one of the things I love about being a naturopathic doctor is we take a step back and say, okay, the heart and the gut wants to work together, the brain wants to work together. What's going on here that's like we're having some disconnect or some struggle with it? And maybe there is like this intestinal permeability, leaky gut picture that's playing a role. Maybe the person is having food dye all the time. And I was telling you about my brother and like how Red 40 just threw him into hyperactivity like none other. And then we kept him away from the Red 40 and it was like it was like night and day difference.
Yeah.
And it's like it can be that simple. It's not always that simple. It's just the one thing. It's like usually a multifactorial thing. And the world we live in is just, it's gotten messy in a way that's like not supportive of like humanity and our like natural way of being in the world.
Yeah, and I think that's actually one of the big components that that is at play here that we don't take into effect, and why so many people, you know, right now it's 1 in 4 adults and 1 in 3 teens in America qualify or meet diagnostic criteria for a mental health disorder.
That's a lot.
That's huge. That's huge. And
That's
I think it's
33% of teenagers?
Yeah.
Wow.
And my clinical experience has, said that it's at least that much.
Yeah.
It's significant.
I see quite a few adolescents that this is kind of their like demeanor, and whether it's the schools, and I know we were kind of chatting about this with your kids, like you gotta go to college, you gotta do this, and the schools are just putting so much pressure on kids. Like the kids are putting so much pressure on themselves to like achieve and obtain and be good and get straight A's and like play 5 sports and, you know, have good friends and like go to bed for 3 hours and then do it again the next day. And it's like, when do these kids get to be kids and just like roll in the dirt and like fall down and skin their knee and like, you know, be ridiculous and make up stories in their head about like, you know, what it's to be a kid?
Yeah, and so like not only is there the body, which again, the conventional model is almost exclusively focused on the body, and the body includes the brain and the neurochemistry of the brain. And neurology and, you know, all of our neurological pathways. That's mostly the conventional model, almost exclusively focuses on that.
Right.
And then the counseling model, it almost exclusively focuses on the psychology of the mind, right? And we have this system that says like, okay, well, here's physical health and here's mental health, and these two things are separate, and there's a giant chasm in between that it's a you know, the DMZ, not allowed to cross, you know, that zone in between, keeping them separate. Now that has been breaking down over the last, you know, I would say 10 to 20 years. There begins to be, especially from the counseling side, more inroads into the somatic
Yeah.
the somatic experience as well. And for those who don't know, somatic means body,
Yeah.
right? And it's more about the sensory and emotional experience of the body in connection with the mind is, I think, what most people mean when they say somatic.
You know, what's really interesting, I was listening to a podcast with a PhD psychologist, and she was talking about how people that have PTSD that were in the military in the United States are different than people that have PTSD that were in other countries.
This
And
is a whole thing.
This is like how we frame it. Like it's that same thing, like that disempowerment of you have this problem, there's nothing you can do about it. Poor you, you're damned for life, basically.
Yeah, this is actually a really interesting topic, and let's like sit that right here and come back around to it, because there's one more point we need to discuss before we can get there. So like, you know, we have the conventional medical model focuses on the body,
Yep.
the counseling psychological model that focuses on the mind and our psychology. But then, like, what do I mean when I say spirit? I'm not talking about religion. I'm not talking about religion here. When I use the term spirit, I mean the interaction between things.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons that, like, the spirit, quote unquote, cannot be measured, because it's not a material thing, it's a dynamic relationship. So the relationship between the mind and the body, the relationship between a mind and a body and the people that are involved in somebody's life, the dynamic between a person and the environment and the society they live in, right? It's all about the connection and interactions between things. That's what I mean when I use the term spirit.
Okay, interesting.
So not only do we have a physical reality and a psychological reality, but we are also not existing in a vacuum.
Nope,
right?
we sure aren't.
And in the model that we have, we treat every individual as an autonomous unit that almost
separate
exists
from everything else.
separate from everything else, and we try to treat that unit as if it's environment, as if it's society, as if it's family, if it's home environment. All those things don't have a direct impact on both psychological and physiological function.
They absolutely do.
And we all know experientially that that's rubbish, right? We all know how affected we are by our relationships, by our environment, the food we eat, the homes we live in.
Yeah, the safety we may or may not feel at home.
100%.
You know, this is, so one of the questions I have on my new patient questionnaire is, do you have some kind of spiritual practice or faith in something? And like I leave it very vague and open-ended. And I have very few people that say no. But those people that say no, I don't see them get better the same way. Like they don't, like there's no tangible like belief in something else. And I, again, don't care what flavor that is, as long as there's something. If you believe that unicorns rule the world, frick yeah, I'm about it. And if you want to say like the super like Christian, like Orthodox people that are like God and Jesus are the only thing, like fantastic. I'm glad you have something to lean on that's a little bit bigger than yourself and some kind of structure to go forward. I'm curious if you see something similar in people that do or do not have faith in something.
Yeah, so, you know, I define spirituality as non-religious,
100%.
but that does not mean that spirituality and religion and religious frameworks are not intimately intertwined.
Yes.
And because our interactions with other people, with our society, with a higher power, if you believe in a higher power, with our environment, are so big, so complex, and so nebulous, we need frameworks to be able to understand and to navigate that very complex terrain. Right. And so the response that we've seen throughout cultures, throughout human history, is that we need religious frameworks to be able to have some tangible way to understand and navigate our interactions with everything around us. And that's taken many forms throughout human history, all around the world. And, you know, people will say, well, some people will say that, oh, all religion is the same. It's just like different packaging, it's different terminology, but it all gets down to the same point. I would disagree with that.
Okay.
I would disagree with that. There are some significant similarities between most or all religions, but there are also some dramatic differences
For sure.
as well. I've grew up conservative Christian environment. I spent over a decade living in India. I got to spend 5 years living in a Hindu village, 5 years living in a Buddhist village. I've gotten to meet people of all faiths. And there are some great similarities and there are some incredible differences too.
Sure.
I think that those differences of philosophy and theology and expression of that religious impulse are well suited to the environment that they developed in. Right? And not all environments are the same, and that's why we need different frameworks. Because the framework that developed, say, in the Middle East may not be applicable in the jungles of the Amazon for an Amazonian tribe with little interaction with the outside world.
Right.
So it's religion is a framework and it's a tool for understanding and navigating spirituality.
Yeah.
Right. But it is also geographically, contextually, and time specific. Right? It's a culturally developed framework.
Yeah.
And you know, a lot of people who are orthodox in their beliefs would probably disagree with me on that, and that's okay. That's fine.
I've had disagreements about those things too with people that are very firm in their beliefs, and everyone's entitled to their own opinion as long as we walk away still having mutual respect for each other. And I have a hard time when people are like, yeah, well, those people that live in the Amazon or that live in the jungles of India and Africa are just like, they're just going to hell. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense, because what you just said, like, the environment they grew up in is not the environment that you and I have grown up in.
Right.
And even you and I have grown up in slightly different environments as well, because my mom converted to Islam when I was in middle school. And it was like so beautiful to see that community rally for our family when my Baptist Christian church wouldn't. And it's like, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
And, you know, not pointing fingers or anything like that, but it's just a curious place to like find myself in.
Right. And I think at the end of the day, like, to go back to your original question, and then we need to go back to the PTSD.
The PTSD, yes.
Why do people with a religious framework, why do they tend to? And there's actually been research around the power of prayer, the value of being connected with a spiritual community, and how people who are involved with a religious community like the Seventh-day Adventists are one of the longest living and healthiest populations in the world. And they have a very close-knit, like tight-knit community.
Yeah.
It's because it really is a pursuit of meaning and purpose.
Yeah.
And when people have meaning and purpose in their life, you know, in naturopathic terms, that's stimulating to, you know, the vis.
Yeah.
You know, the vis, which is, you know, our natural capacity to heal, to grow, to progress.
Our vital force, our innate intelligence, the thing that when we cut our finger, we don't tell it to clot and heal and create a scab, it just does that.
Yeah, it's the will to live.
The will to live, exactly.
It's the will to live. And so when people don't have a framework for understanding or don't believe in a spiritual connection between anything, what is the meaning, what is the purpose, right? And then how does that trickle down physiologically to the way our body behaves, the way it heals itself, our immune function, our metabolism?
Right.
Like, these are measurable things.
Right.
So, okay, so we were on religion and spirituality there.
Right.
So
one more piece before we jump to the PTSD. And I've shared this before. I was never more miserable as my own human as when I was atheist. I was miserable, and I slung that yuck onto everybody too. I would say really horrible things to people, like, oh, God is for weak people. And now, in retrospect, I see that admitting that I am only one creature and I can't carry the weight of the world, I see the immense amount of strength and courage it takes to say, hey, I need some kind of framework to lean on so my soul can grow and progress in this lifetime so I can be a good person. Not for someone else, but for my own, like, edification, if you will. And I'm grateful to have had that. It was developmental biology that brought my faith back. Science, who knew that could bring your faith back? I was like, how does a cell know to become a hand and a foot, and they're the same cell? That is, I've never had someone be able to answer that question.
Yeah.
It just knows because there's that innate intelligence.
And the deepest question of all is, why is there something when the most common sense thing, like if you use Occam's razor, the most common sense thing it would be that there would be nothing.
Correct.
Just nothing.
Yep.
No space, no time, no matter,
Nihilism.
nothing. Yet somehow, here we are. And the very fact, even within just the purely, you know, a purely scientific model, if you look at the entire universe and how rare life is, the very fact that we exist, the very fact that we are here is completely improbable, right? And yet we are here and we're existing. How is that? Why is that?
With all 10 toes and all 10 fingers, like, it's literally amazing how well it goes most of the time. Okay, so we have some neurodivergence. We got some people with webbed fingers and webbed toes. Like, yeah, there's some differences, but it's pretty phenomenal that it goes right most of the time.
Right, right. And, you know, and different people, different traditions are going to define this in different ways. Science is going to define this in different ways, but there is an intelligence behind all of this. And whether that intelligence be the physics of space-time and how that led to the whole evolutionary model and that brought us here, or whether you're a member of a faith tradition, the thing that matters is that we're here.
We're here.
And we have this rare gift to exist. And it is really wild and confusing to know how to navigate it. And we need some help. We need some tools and framework through culture, through religion, through so many different avenues, through science, to let us know how to navigate this world gracefully and enjoy this gift that we've been given.
Seriously,
right?
And this is why the whole, like, it takes a village to raise a family. It's like sometimes you need that great auntie over here that you're not going to talk to your parents about that thing, and like auntie's cool and she'll tell you whatever, you know, is on her mind, like, honestly, and help you become a better kid to be able to better understand why your parents said no, you can't do that thing.
Perfect segue back into the PTSD discussion. Okay. So this is awesome, and if you haven't read it, there's a really, really good book on this called Tribe by Sebastian Junger.
Okay.
Sebastian Junger was a war correspondent who was in Iraq, Afghanistan, Serbia. Like, he covered a lot of conflict zones, and he came up with this dogged question, which was, why, if our troops are seeing less and less and less frontline combat, are we developing PTSD and other mental health conditions in veterans and having higher suicide rates amongst veterans, higher substance use and alcohol use disorder rates among veterans than we've ever seen before? Why is that happening now, even though soldiers are seeing less and less frontline combat and also engaging in warfare in much less the only word I can think of right now is intimate, but I mean like actual face-to-face.
Right, like a drone strike as opposed to like stabbing someone.
And actually, interestingly, drone operators are one of the individuals that actually have one of the greatest rates of PTSD.
Whoa,
which
weird.
Flies in the face, I think, of how we think about PTSD.
Okay.
Right? Okay, so let's hit pause and let's come back around to what you were talking about with aunties. Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the weaknesses in our conventional model, what we already talked about, is that every individual is an autonomous little packet, and that our health ends at the border of our skin, right?
If only that was the case.
Right. You know, this is like very like all the way back down to cellular biology. It's like, well, there's the inside of the cell and the outside, and you have a membrane, and the membrane separates self and non-self.
Right.
Right. But even in that cell, things come across that membrane. Things are absorbed. Things are excreted. There are, chemosensors on the surface of a cell that detect threat and respond to threat. Right.
Chemosensors, chemical responses that say, oh, what's going on over here? Like kind of like spidey senses, if you will.
Right. So this echoes all the way up through our most complex life forms, is that we have the ability to sense and respond to our environment.
Yeah.
But something interesting happened. We're not just single cellular organisms anymore. We are multicellular, and multicellular is a community of cells working together, communicating with each other with a shared purpose.
And now is this including our microbes that are actually on the outside of our body, not even inside of us?
We will get there. We will get there. Okay. But let's jump from from single cell, multicellular, all the way up to Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
If you look at our evolutionary history, throughout most of history, we have existed in groups of 50 to 150 people. And most of those people who we existed with looked, sounded, smelled, ate, behaved similar to ourselves, right? So we as humans, we don't have fangs, we don't have claws, we can't run that fast, we can't jump that high, we don't have like rhino armor, we don't have poison barbs. Like we're really pretty vulnerable sacks of meat.
We're pretty fragile, yeah, we're very fragile creatures.
So how is it that we as humans have gotten in the position that we have gotten as the species, as really the apex predators on planet Earth now?
Yeah.
Well, we had a very, very different survival strategy. With that, our survival strategy was to belong to a community, right?
Hence the antes. Okay.
We are social creatures. We are social creatures, and we are part of a collective. And we only feel safe psychologically when we belong to a group. And anything that threatens our belonging to a group has a whole cascade of, triggering our stress response that makes us feel as if we are going to die. Okay, so we are used to being part of a small tribe, hence the name of Sebastian Junger's book. And whenever anything threatens our place in a tribe, or if we don't have a tribe, it is so psychologically threatening to us. And that psychological threat creates physiological changes in our body.
Right. Real and perceived doesn't matter. It's the fact that we feel that threat.
All it has to be is a perceived
Yes.
threat.
This is why watching scary movies and crime TV is not
so
helpful.
But also in another way so exciting as well. Why we feel such an emotional response is because our brain did not evolve with screens.
No.
Right? And it is very, very poor at deciphering, especially in the more primitive parts of our brain, the difference between what's happening on a screen and what's happening in reality. And that's why movies are so evocative. They're such an experience because it feels like it's really happening, especially when you really get sucked into a story. Yeah. So how does this connect back to the PTSD? Mm-hmm. If you look back at like World War I, World War II, if you look at what happened in the trenches in World War I, where we were gassing trenches with chlorine gas, where we were using flamethrowers and razor wire, and it was brutal. The first mechanized war, it was such a horrific war. And there were plenty of people who came home with, what was called in earlier wars shell shock.
Shell shock, right.
Shell shock from that experience, but it was at a lower rate than we are experiencing now.
Right.
Obviously, plenty of horrors in World War II, in Vietnam, or Korea and Vietnam. But as we've progressed into modern times, there's been less hand-to-hand combat. And we also have this thing called the Geneva Convention, which most of the time prohibits, these really egregious crimes against humanity.
No chemical warfare. That's
no
bad
chemical.
stuff.
I mean, mustard gas and chlorine gas. It was World War I was, I think, the low point.
But this is where you're getting at, though. Like the World War I, World War II vets that I had an opportunity to know when I was a kid, they were like brethren. They were like, those are my people. I was in the trenches with them. We were there together.
Right, and here's the difference. Not only did they have their tribe, because when you're part of a platoon in the military, you still have a tribe that you belong to.
Yeah.
But back in World War I, World War II, you had a community to return to. Most of those people came from a small town.
Yeah, right.
That not only knew them and supported them, but celebrated them when they returned or mourned them when they didn't.
Right, together as a community.
Vietnam was really the first war where soldiers returned to a community that did not trust them, that doubted them, and actually criticized them for what they had done overseas. Right? And so all of a sudden, boom, after Vietnam, you begin to see this big time increase in mental health challenges for returning veterans. So they were always there, but it got amplified because they returned to a community that did not support, understand, and know them.
Right.
So when you leave the military and come back to civilian life, you would think, well, you're returning to safety, right? You were getting shot at every day. But exclusion from the community is a greater threat to the human mind than actual physical threat.
So we're social creatures is what you're saying, whether we like people or not, too bad.
It is our primary survival strategy.
Yeah.
So when you come back, it's not just bringing the trauma of war back with you. It's the trauma of losing the tribe you had when you were in the military. And a lot of people didn't have a tribe before they went into the military. And then getting into the military, suddenly you have this brotherhood, or whatever, and also sisterhood as well.
Right.
And so for the first time ever, it's like, I actually belong to something. And then whenever you come back and you leave the military, you've lost that. And what do you have? It's isolation.
Yeah.
My primary, I'll say one of my strongest convictions, I'll put it that way, that I had after living over a decade in South Asia and then returning to America was that isolation is a primary driver of both our mental health and physical health conditions in this country.
Yeah.
When I was in India in an undeveloped setting, I called them diseases of exposure. Right? So there's a cost of being a collective, right? It's exposure to other human beings that can pass on disease. But a lot of those diseases of exposure we can prevent with hygiene and sanitation and all these tools that we have that we've seen cause an immense increase in life expectancy over the last 100 years, right? So diseases of exposure you can deal with, you can mitigate.
Right.
Diseases of isolation, on the other hand, are insidious.
Much more challenging. My understanding, and we haven't really talked about substance use disorder, addiction.
Yes.
Addiction, the opposite of addiction is connection. So there's that like mouse study where they put a mouse in a cage by himself and he gave him just enough to like be fine, and he chose the cocaine. But then he put him in a little community with other rats and like things to keep their mind, you know, little obstacle courses. And the mouse didn't care about the cocaine anymore. He was like, I got my people, or I got my other mice friends.
Yeah.
It's like, I feel good now.
Right, because we have mirror neurons in our brain that we are, I mean, even like if you look at us right now.
Right, we're sitting
look
very
at our
similar.
body language.
Yep.
Right, we do this completely subconsciously, is that we mirror the people who we are with, and we use other individuals to co-regulate our emotions and our psychological states.
Yep.
When we are with somebody who feels comfortable and safe and relaxed, our nervous system calms down. But when we're with somebody who's on edge or feels threatening,
Right.
then suddenly...
Right, exactly. It's like, I'm not sure about you.
Yeah,
I don't want
exactly.
to share my heart space with you.
So here we go. Here we are. We had single cell organisms that eventually banded together to make multicellular organisms, and they're sending molecules between each other to co-regulate each other and behave like a tissue or like an
Right.
organism. Right? So now we had a collective society as a human species, and the bigger and bigger we've moved towards this model that has broken us down back almost like we're single cell organisms, where we have to exist in a vacuum. We have nothing to co-regulate with.
Right,
Right? We are isolated and we have no idea what to do.
right.
And then we create medicines and treatments and therapies and approaches to try to medicate away the lack of regulation that we have with
Right.
other human beings. But we're not talking about the root cause,
No.
right? We are propping up our place in a place of dysfunction
Right.
and trying to survive a dysfunctional environment that we live in.
You know, it's so interesting, like, a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's related in that, like, there's this surplus of people that live by themselves now. Way more than we've seen in history before, is my understanding, at least in the United States. And they are, like, fiercely independent, and I don't need this, and I'm thinking about several women I know. And they would rather live by themselves than even deal with the potential of a romantic relationship, because there's too many variables there. And what if they're not this, and what if they're not that? And like, I hear this from some of my patients even.
Yeah.
And the tricky thing I have is like, at what point are you willing to compromise and say, hey, you know what, I'm a human, and despite not enjoying every single piece of every single person I engage with, I would rather have a friend in someone than expect them to be exactly the same way as I am.
Right. And yeah, and like no survival strategy is perfect, right?
No.
And having to interact and live with other human beings is complicated.
It is.
Right? And that's why we need frameworks like religion and society to know how to navigate this terrain, right? But America is a particularly interesting case. And I didn't really, I had a sense of it, but I didn't fully see it until I spent over a decade completely immersed in a different culture, thinking and speaking and even dreaming in a different language. You know,
So interesting, dreaming in another language.
yeah, just like, and it wasn't until I had the opportunity to be completely immersed in a different culture for an extended period of time that I came back and I began to notice things about this culture that
Right.
I'd never noticed before. And one of the things that I noticed is that I began to connect the dots on is, oh, of course, we are all the ones who left home. And again, this is not the native communities. I'm
Right.
talking about all the white settlers, the colonists that came to occupy America.
Right, right.
But for all the, quote unquote, Western individuals that came to settle and colonize America, we were all the ones that didn't stay with our society. We were the ones that left home, right? We were a lot of the, how we talked about the berry finders and the, the neurodivergent ones. It was like we selected for all of those people.
Interesting.
And so we all came. We are the ones that said, you know what, I'm better off on my own. I call it the cowboy spirit. America has this cowboy spirit, and we have this deep, deep core belief, which is, I'm better off on my own than I am with other people. You had to have that spirit to hop in a Conestoga wagon and go across
Yeah.
the plains and put a flag in the ground
Yeah,
and
the
says,
Oregon Trail.
I'm going to do it right here.
Right, or a canoe across some of the big, like the Columbia or something. I'm just like, I can't even imagine that. Canoes are so tippy. Why would you get in a canoe across this giant river? Because that's where you needed to go. It just was.
And of course, that type of a population with that type of culture, that kind of values, was going to be in conflict with the Native American communities, because the
Collective
Native American communities understood the value of community, of the collective, but then also their relationship with the environment.
Yes.
And we had Manifest Destiny, and Manifest Destiny said, the world is yours, you just need to go out and conquer it. And so go out, conquer it. Harvest those buffalo, chop down those forests, claim the land, plant your flag, where the Native Americans had this awe, reverence, and respect, a spiritual relationship with their
Yes.
environment that says, this is an essential, important part of who we are as a people.
Yeah.
We have to treat it with honor and respect, just like we have to honor and respect our elders.
In each other. So like this is something, I've heard ADD referred to as nature deficit disorder. I think it's a little more complex than that, but oftentimes I encourage people to go outside. I have some people I've worked with that are too scared to go outside for a number of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I don't care about those things. Like those things are out of our control. And, an example is like the person in our neighborhood that uses, fragrance dryer sheets. And you can smell them when you're on a walk. It's like, okay, that's out of my control. Do I care about that, or do I want to go for a walk instead? I think the benefits of being outside supersede the negative experience of, whatever we have going on in our atmosphere or whatever. Like get outside, we need sun exposure, we need the fresh air, we need the wind in our hair, we need to feel our feet on the earth, not cement, not asphalt, but actually on the ground.
Yeah, so this is exactly what prompted me to become a naturopathic doctor. And I always say, I think you've heard me say, I'm the least likely person ever to have become a naturopathic doctor.
Right.
I grew up in southern Indiana on a popcorn farm. I grew up in a very religiously and politically conservative environment. I had no exposure to anything except for the conventional model. I never even knew that any of these things existed. Right. And, I wound up living in this very remote village in a Nepali community in the Indian Himalayas. And life there was challenging. I lived in a dirt floor hut. I cooked on a fire. I had to carry my water. It was a 2-hour walk to the nearest marketplace to buy things, and I could only buy groceries one day a week. And everything I bought, everything I had to eat, I had to carry on my back to the village. Like life was difficult, but after I'd been there 2 or 3 months, I woke up one day and I thought, oh, this is what it feels like to be healthy.
Yeah.
And I considered myself a very healthy person, especially for like an 80s Indiana boy. I was healthy. Like I love vegetables. Like I ate whole grain bread instead of the Wonder Bread.
Right.
I was outdoorsy and I got a lot of physical activity. I was like, like back in the 90s, like when I was a teen, it was like healthy was eating Snackwell's cookies, compared to that, I was like, I don't want any of that crap. I want real food. Real food tasted good to me.
Yeah.
So like relative to my own environment, I was a pretty healthy person.
Right.
But then 2 or 3 months into living in that environment, out deeply connected with nature, I woke up one day and thought, I have never felt this clear-minded. I've never felt this energetic. I've never felt this good in my life.
Right.
I thought I knew what healthy was, but my baseline was not health. And it took me, embarrassingly, years to slowly piece together why I felt so good.
Right.
Or why I felt so good, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and one of the things you said that not many families even have one meal together anymore these days in the United States.
That's right.
And there was no TV, there was no other thing. You got together and you hung out with your neighbors. That's what you did for entertainment.
That's right. And like I went to sleep with the sun going down. I woke up with the sun rising. I went a month at a time with only hearing wind in the trees and water on rocks, and the breeze blowing through the corn.
I hear my brain relaxing already.
And the sound of frogs and birds. And I have a very restless mind, restless spirit by nature, and I just felt myself. I just felt this peace settle within me in that environment that I'd never felt before. But not only that, spiritually, at that point in time, the reason I wanted to go and serve other people, I ended up, starting schools and health centers and an ambulance service. And the reason I wanted to serve other people was because, and I'm very grateful for the spiritual, religious environment I grew up in, that made me want to do things to help others.
Yeah, serve other people.
So the other thing that I had there was a sense of meaning and purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And I would not have had that sense of meaning and purpose without the spiritual and religious framework that I had grown up in.
Right.
And that brought me into connection with other people's lives in a way. And serving people in health brought me not just in contact with their bodies, but with their minds and their spirits.
Yeah.
And I got to develop these incredible, intimate relationships with people that I would have never known otherwise.
Right.
And eventually I was just like, oh man, I gotta become a doctor. Like, I love this, not because I wanna be a hero or a savior and fix people. It's because I really enjoy people.
Yeah.
And it brought me so deeply. Healthcare cuts through
It does.
all those layers and those buffers and everything, and you get to see, if you're open to it,
Like the raw humanity
the
that
raw
sits before
reality of this shared
Yeah.
humanity of like, whoa, being human is wonderful and messy.
Yeah, it sure is. And like this is, to kind of bring us full circle, like dismantling the current paradigm really only focuses on one aspect. And we're talking about literally every single piece that impacts the quality of our life.
Every piece.
The community, our experience out in the outdoor world. And I'm not talking like the Colorado outdoor person that's like, I'm going skiing today and then this afternoon I'm going biking and then, I'm going to go have a burger and beer. Like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about like actually connecting and being more intentional and going the pace of human.
Yes.
The pace of human is not 700 miles in a jet. It's not 60 miles in a car. We could argue that a bike and walking are a little more appropriate for our human conditioning to be able to like keep up with the environment. And I know when I bike, I am so much more connected to my environment and my community, my neighborhood. I see things. I'm like, oh, I didn't notice that mailbox before. Versus when I drive, it's a little more like disconnecting.
Yeah, when I'm a cyclist as well, and when I cycle, I call it moving meditation.
Yeah.
And I love it. But I think a great example, and okay, I don't know how this is going to land with people, but I'm not saying this is the only way to look at our modern society, but this is one way we can think about it and kind of stand back and look at it through this lens. If you take a panda bear out of, the forest of Sichuan province in China, and you take it and put it in a zoo in Washington, D.C.,
Right.
it suddenly begins to have health struggles. It doesn't want to mate. Like, how hard has it been to get pandas to mate in captivity?
Very difficult.
Very difficult, very difficult, right? And the environment that is in is not conducive for that animal to thrive. Even if we create these habitats that mirror or mimic their natural habitats, it's still confined, it's limited. And deep down inside, that panda knows that, like, there's really no point for me to mate and produce, reproduce and perpetuate like my species, because like I'm not even supposed to be here. Right. In whatever way a panda understands that.
Right.
Clearly a panda in captivity behaves differently than a panda in the wild.
I mean,
right?
we could say this about any animal in captivity. Like
100%.
You throw a group of wolves in a zoo, and I used to think about this when I was a kid. Like, I loved going to the zoo because I love animals. But I'm like, wolves aren't supposed to be like, this is like the size of my house, and like their range is like hundreds of miles, and they're just like in this like, I don't even know if it's a mile wide container.
Oh, not even close.
Right. It's like, that seems so inhumane.
Well, now let's think about it through that lens. What is our environment as a species?
A box in a box in a box.
Oh gosh, okay, yeah, I've got to tell you my box life thing, but anyways, it sounds, that's great, I love that you just said that. So throughout the vast majority of our development as a species, we were hunters and gatherers in a small tribe of 50 to 150 people.
And we were nomadic.
We have only been settled agrarian individuals for 8,000-10,000 years, maybe a little bit longer in a few isolated pockets, but agriculture and like permanent settlements, civilization as we now define it, has really only been a thing for about 8,000 to 10,000 years for the most part. The problem is even like the environment that I lived in India was an agrarian, like settled civilization. But even that, which made me feel so much better, right? that's not actually our native state. That's not what we evolved for, right? We evolved to be on the move. We evolved to be in nature. We evolved to be moving through the seasons and harvesting different things in the wild at certain times, berries in this season, and then, the grains that grew up in the swamp in this other season, and then we would track down some prey. We were opportunistic omnivores, like we were talking about last night.
Yeah.
And now suddenly we have been taken out of our natural context, right? And that we had to band together as a society, right, to survive. We've plopped ourselves in a very elaborate zoo that we have constructed for ourselves.
Pretty much.
We have broken ourselves up into individual autonomous units, and then more than any other society or culture in history, in America, we have said, not only is that right, it is the greatest and highest virtue. You are to be independent. You are to be autonomous.
Right.
Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You don't need anybody but yourself and your own wits and your own brawn.
Right.
That is the core of our cultural myth.
100%.
So much so. This is a great story.
Yeah.
Okay, so this was like really cooking in my mind whenever I first moved back to the States. And at the time, my oldest son, Asher, was about 8 years old. And we are walking down the street in Boulder, Colorado, okay? And there I see this statue. And the statue is this guy who, do you remember Fabio? He was like that romance novel model from the 90s
sure, yeah.
with the flowing blonde hair
yeah.
and the chiseled abs and pec.
Yeah.
This guy, it was a statue of this dude, kind of looked like Fabio. It was like Greco-Roman beauty and physical perfection.
Yeah.
And he's got in his right hand a hammer and in the left hand a chisel. Okay? He's like perfection to about right here, and then he becomes rocky and chunky and everything. And he's got the chisel right against his like hip, if I remember right, and the hammer on the other side, like this, like he's, and then it's like rocky and unfinished down below.
Right, like he's crafting himself.
And at the bottom there was a placard, and it said, "The Self-Made Man."
Oh.
And I sat there, and it just like, that was the moment when all these threads that I had been experientially learning by living cross-culturally just snapped, and I was like, oh, there it is. That is our central cultural myth in America. Like, that is it, right there embodied. So I turned to my 8-year-old, and I said, "Hey, Asher, what do you think about that statue?" He's like, it's kind of interesting. I kind of like it, and I also kind of don't. And I was like, okay. I'm like, there is one big fallacy with this statue. And I want to see if you can point out what's wrong with this to me. He's like, sits there for a second, an 8-year-old. I love it because kids haven't been trained to be dumb yet.
Yep, exactly.
Right? They're still so smart.
They're open to
they're
the potential.
so smart. They see it. They haven't learned to tune out all the obvious things. And so they're brilliant. Children are so brilliant. And so he's like, who carved out his arms so he could use his arms, and who gave him the hammer and chisel? And I was like, yes! I was like, yes, you nailed it.
Yeah.
You nailed it. He couldn't be without the help of others.
Yeah, it's required.
It is essential.
Yeah.
How did he carve out the top half of him so that he could carve out the bottom? It's a fallacy. And some cultural myths are very beneficial, but I believe this myth to be pathological.
Yeah.
And I think that it is at the very core of why we are the richest, most affluent country in the world, but at the same time have the worst mental health statistics in the developed world.
Yeah.
We spend twice as much on healthcare per capita than any other nation, 18% of our GDP.
Jesus.
And we are 29 or 30 out of 30 of the 30 most developed nations in the world on almost every health statistic, mental and physical.
Wow.
We are one of only 5 countries in the world with a declining life expectancy. And the other countries on that list, Sudan, Syria,
where there's civil war.
North Korea,
Wow.
and the U.S. So clearly something is wrong.
We're obviously deficient in SSRIs, Ryan. That's clearly the solution. So this is what's really interesting to me too. Like as someone that's really interested in gut health and the microbiome of the health. So there was some studies done. So when I moved to Seattle from Gunnison, Colorado, which is a really small mountain town here in Colorado, smaller than Montrose. And it took me about a year and a half to get used to how loud it was in Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
Like we had airplanes pretty much like every 45 minutes flying over for SeaTac.
Right.
Because it was like the path for them to land on the, whatever the airway track. What the heck is that called? I can't even freaking remember.
The tarmac?
The tarmac, thank you.
There we go.
And the sound of the nonstop highway traffic and the horns and like everything. Like it took me a year and a half to be able to sleep through that sound and my nervous system saying, no, this is safe and normal.
Yeah, a little bit different effect than wind and trees and water
Definitely.
and rocks. Yeah.
So, but what the study that I found when I was doing a deep dive on the microbiome was people in cities have much more rates of things like bipolar and schizophrenia and multiple personality disorders.
Yep.
And exposure to noise changes our microbiota.
Mm-hmm.
Cities are very, very noisy. And then you go to some of the new apartment complexes in Ballard, Seattle area, and you're paying $3,600 for a 300 square foot prison.
Yeah.
You know, basically
Zoo.
it literally is like a cement, structure with like very little color. It looks like a prison cell in my brain.
Yeah.
I'm like, you're paying $3,600 a month for this to live in Ballard? No, thank you.
Yeah.
Where you may or may not have a parking spot.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't wonder why mental health rates are higher and people on the streets in Seattle, and I would say it's probably similar in Denver as far as the noise pollution and stuff like that goes, but like you walk past people taking dumps in the street and smoking crack, a mile or, on the same block as one of the clinics I spent most of my time at.
Mm-hmm.
That's disturbing to my soul. I'm cool with people doing whatever they want, people, their own creatures. I don't need to see that, and I don't see that in Montrose. I'm curious why that is, and I think it's because there's less noise. There's more access to like vantage points. Like I can look out my window and see the mountains like way out there. You couldn't really see that in Seattle. I think weather does play a role too, and then the gray weather affected my mental health significantly.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm Colorado born and raised, so it's like hard to, I like the sun.
Right.
It's like noise in the city, light pollution contributes to mental health and changes our microbiota.
So this is one of those areas this is what I mean. This falls in that category of spiritual health.
Right.
Because it's about the connection and the relationship between us and our environment. Ooh, so much to talk about here.
So much.
So much to talk about here. So, like for the listeners, let's introduce one concept that I think is a new concept for a lot of people. And then that concept is that our GI tract, from rooter to tutor, and the whole tube in between is actually the outside world.
It is. We're donuts. We're a Taurus. I've talked about this actually.
Yes. So, like for listeners who aren't familiar with this concept, and this is not a fringe alternative concept. This is just basic anatomy and physiology. This is, this is biology 101. Is that we and a lot of multicellular organisms, we're basically a donut. If you were to look like this through the mouth and straight out the anus. Sorry, no, it's not it's not a comfortable thought, but we are like a donut. We are a tube, and everything in our GI tract is the outside world. So just like the outside of our body has a relationship with the outside world, when our GI tract is interacting with what is in our gut, it is interacting with the outside world.
Yeah.
Interestingly. Okay, let's hit pause. I got to go back a couple conceptual steps. So remember we talked about with the single cellular organism that we have receptors that perceive threat in the outside world and respond to it, right? So even a single cell organism, if it notices a chemical threat, it will turn and use its little cilia and turn the opposite direction and flee from it. But if it also senses food or a positive environment, it will go towards it.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
We need that.
So as we've become more complex, like how do we, and this is so central in mental health, in every mental health model. We use our senses, not chemoreceptors, although we do use chemoreceptors as well, but we also have sight and sound and smell. Chemoreceptors, we have our smell and our taste. We have tactile touch. We have our psychological processes that perceive the psychology of what we're interacting with.
So that would be our vagus nerve.
Yes, that's a whole multiple podcast talking about vagus nerve. But basically we're sensing, perceiving, and reacting to our environment. The same pathways the same neural pathways, the same signaling, like chemical pathways in our body that respond to threats, perceived threats in our outside world, also perceive to the threats in the outside world of our GI tract.
Right.
So whenever we eat something, right, that is contaminated, like food poisoning, you're going to see the same kind of releases of cortisol and histamine and everything, just as if a bear were charging at us.
Right.
Right. I mean, obviously tuned and tweaked in a different way, but the same basic pattern.
Body says this is bad, get rid of it.
Okay, so there's one whole set of concepts, which is the inside of our GI tract is the outside world, and we perceive and respond to threat and benefit there, just like we do with the outside world.
Right.
Here's the part that I think is really hard for Western people, but particularly American people, to really come to terms with, because it challenges our sense of identity and individuality. And that is, you're deeper in GI than I am, although because I'm in mental health,
It's the same.
I deal with GI all the time.
I was a rebel. I was like, it can't all start in the gut. And then like, it kind of does. And I am annoyed by that, but also here we are.
The last statistic I heard, and you can tell me maybe this has been updated, is that there are 10 times as many bacterial cells in our body than there are human cells.
Something like that. I can't remember the
It's
statistic, but it's like out significantly larger the amount of bacterial DNA that we have compared to our own human DNA.
Oh yes,
even.
yeah.
Like it's astronomical.
Yeah, that's even a bigger scale.
We
That's
are
like,
a symbiotic creature. We are our own world in and of itself, macrocosm, microcosm.
Okay.
That's the way I think about it.
Yeah, exactly. And that doesn't mean that like the mass of those cells is greater, although if you took all the bacterial cells in our body and you lumped them together, they would be about the size and weight of our brain.
Wow, that's insane.
Our microbiome is an intelligence that
Yeah.
lives inside of us, and it communicates through our membranes with our immune system, with our nervous system. And not only do I sit here and co-regulate with you, internally I'm co-regulating with my microbiome. My microbiome is chemically speaking to my immune system and regulating it and helping it to perceive what is threat and what is not.
Dynamically. We are dynamic. I like to say we are homeodynamic as opposed to homeostatic.
Yeah.
Because we're constantly doing these micro adjustments that we don't even perceive most of the time.
Oh, so many levels all
Yeah.
the time in every way. So this is, I think, really unnerving for a lot of people, but there were some awesome studies, and I know you have to already know about these, but for the listeners, right? There was this mouse study where they took a big population of lab mice, and they had some criteria to decide who were the aggressive and who were the docile mice, right? They separated them into two different populations. So they had this very docile population, this very aggressive, very angry population of mice. So then they studied their microbiome, and they found that there were dramatic differences in the microbiome of the angry mice versus the docile mice.
Interesting.
Okay, that's observational. Maybe it's just a correlation.
Sure.
Is it causation?
Right.
So this is what happened next is the amazing thing. So they took fecal samples from the two different populations, and then they gave antibiotics to both populations and wiped out their microbiome. Then they took the feces from the angry mice
Gave them to the docile.
and inoculated the food of the docile mice, and they took the feces of the docile mice and inoculated the food of the angry mice. The docile mice became angry, and the angry mice became docile.
Huh. Yeah, so our microbiome does affect our demeanors then.
It affects our cravings, it affects our personality, It affects our mood, because, and this is all the way back to your original question, where do most of the neurotransmitters that control our nervous system get
In our
produced? In the gut.
In the gut.
So our mainline antidepressants are SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. But where does serotonin come from? It comes from the gut. It comes from our microbiome. It comes from our environment, like you were just talking about. And even that, where does it come from? We pick it up from our mothers during a natural birth through the birth canal, right? So then, if we were a cesarean section or we've had major antibiotic treatment, then where does our microbiome come from? It comes from our environment.
Right. None of the dirt that we're sniffing carpet fibers instead.
Right. So to just be like, to boil this all down, to say, well, you have an genetic aberration in your dopamine or your serotonin pathway or whatever, and that's why you're depressed.
And there's nothing else you can do about it. It's so limiting. It's literally you're put in a box, and like we've spent an hour talking about so many aspects to how our mental health is impacted, not only by our mental emotional state, but our microbiome, our environment, our community, our connection to faith or not. Like, it's complex and nuanced. Who would have thought?
Here's the thing, and this is one of the reasons I love naturopathic medicine, is that there is an acknowledgement of this level of complexity and nuance, but yet the interventions to begin to change that are unbelievably simple.
Oh my God, it's so amazing, isn't it?
It's unbelievably simple because throughout evolutionary history, we had no bandwidth for complexity. The simplest, most efficient system is the one that lives. It has a survival advantage if it can figure out how to solve the problem with simplicity rather than complexity. Complexity is metabolically expensive.
Right, that's true.
Right? So if we can tap into those simple innate capacities to self-regulate and heal that evolution has already picked for us,
Right.
then we don't have to do something miraculous or novel.
Right.
Right?
As Dr. Urnell said, what we do as naturopathic doctors is inherently unsexy. We make it frilly with like herbs and some of these other things, but really when we come down to it, like teaching people how to breathe or regulate themselves or feel their body or articulate their emotions, these things seem like so ridiculously simple, and yet they're incredibly profound.
So that's like a perfect segue to another one of my core convictions. I said one of my core convictions is that in the West, our diseases are diseases of isolation.
Yeah.
Right? Another thing that I've come as a core conviction about this society is that we have an insane bias that blinds us to so many good things. And that bias is that for something to be effective, for it to be powerful, for it to be valuable, it needs to be novel, right? So this needs to be something that we just discovered.
Brand new drug.
You know, the novel is always better than the old, right?
In theory.
And again, we are the ADHD cowboys, right? So we're always seeking the novel, right? So it's baked into us probably through our nature as a selected population, but then also through the narrative around science that new is always better than old, right? Discovery, right? To even question that almost kind of feels like heretical.
It kind of does.
Doesn't it? Isn't it kind of jarring? Do you feel that like tension to like challenge?
Like I want it to be good, but I often will think about like the newest drug on the market and how, yeah, maybe it passed clinical trials, but then, you know, once it gets out into the market, then we start seeing like, oh, in the greater population, there's actually a lot more side effects than what the studies show. But it's the new drug, so it's the good one, right?
Right. So it needs to be new. It needs to be man-made, right? And this is where the scientific narrative and the scientific myth has combined with our cowboy myth, our self-made man myth, that it needs to be man-made, that it needs to be expensive, because if it's new and it's a product of science, it's going to be expensive. If it's cheap and it's normal, well, then that means it's old and nobody values it anymore.
Right.
And this is the big one. Complexity is better than simplicity.
Right.
That the more complex a solution is to the problem, the better it is, because it's newer and more complicated and more scientific.
Right.
And that if it's something simple, it's like, well, if it was simple, we would have already been doing it.
Right.
Those
the problem is we're not doing it.
Those cultural biases blind us to obvious, simple, accessible solutions that are literally around us all the time, and we literally are blind to them. We do not see them.
Right.
Because it's not coming in the right packaging to conform with our cultural narrative.
Right. Like one of the conversations I had this week was we breathe 25,000 breaths a day. And how many of those breaths are intentional? In most people's case, 0.
0, oftentimes.
Oftentimes. And when I share that statistic with my clients, they're like, 25,000 breaths, that's a lot. And I'm asking them to do like 3 breaths, in and out, 3 rounds of breathing, just to like, as like a pause check-in the middle of the day. Like, can you do that? 3. And they're like, I often hear, well, I don't, how am I going to remember? Like, that seems like it's a lot of time. It takes 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Take 3 breaths. Notice how you feel before and after. And they're like, wow, like I feel a little more grounded, a little bit like less tension in my head, and, kind of like tuning them into like, hey, it doesn't, you don't need this thing that you think you do, this like complicated new little gold little pill that's going to save the world for $25,000 a month.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing, like I mentioned at the the beginning, that I'm also biofeedback therapist, and breath work and breathing exercises and learning to control our breath is a primary tool within the biofeedback framework. And it's one of those things I have to have kind of a very I'll say scaled down version of the talk we've just had with every single patient, so that we can overcome those biases to see that something as simple as the way we breathe has profound effects on both our physical and our mental health.
Yeah, absolutely.
Beyond profound.
Yeah.
And it's amazing if you think about it that that's even surprising.
Right.
Even if you go back to, like, let's say Judeo-Christian traditions, when did life begin? When God breathed into people. The breath, and then like in the Greeks, pneumos, like breath, and spirit and life were all... And inspiration.
Right.
We deep down inside culturally know how important breath is, how central it is. And it's like we've done to breath in this society what we've done to everything else, like food and everything else that's essential. It's just like, oh, that's that other thing that I have to do so I can do this more important thing. It's just like, yeah, of course I'm breathing, I'm eating, I'm sleeping, whatever.
Right.
But that's not what life's really about.
Yeah, I'll sleep when I'm dead. Yeah, the Foundations for Health is often where I start with the grand majority, unless I have a patient come in on polypharmacy, which means they're on a bunch of medications, and they often will have a lot of nutritional deficiencies, and they kind of need a little support there to kind of get them to be able to sleep better, or get them to be able to go for a walk, even to their mailbox. Like, it can be very, very simple. And,
very simple.
I'm not biofeedback certified, but I've spent a couple shifts when I was a student on the biofeedback rotation. And man, I was a first-year student, and that was my first shift. And there was a lady who was in an abusive relationship. She wanted to go back to school, and she hated her job. And in 3 out of 8 appointments, she comes in, and she's like elated. I haven't seen her look this like excited. She's like, I am filing for divorce, I quit my job, and I enrolled in school. And it's just like, just bringing awareness to her body, how she felt, and helping her shift in 3 weeks. Her breath and the power that she had with just breathing, and that self-awareness it created in her. She was able to say, I'm done with this. This is not working for me. And she's maybe an exception, but like that case really has stuck with me, that it can be that simple.
Right. And if you look at traditional world medicine,
properly traditional.
So like Ayurvedic, yogic traditions, and then also traditional Chinese medicine and all of its manifestations, the acknowledgement of the breath and the way you breathe, whether it be through yoga or whether it be in a tradition like Tai Chi, was always very central. And like even the mind and spirit, if you take that about and you just look at the body, and this is something that has been exhaustively scientifically researched, the mechanisms, oftentimes with the vagus nerve, that the way that that different breathing patterns affect the state of our nervous system. This is scientific fact.
Right.
Even in the most conventional biomedical terms, this is scientific fact.
Right.
Right. And it's just, but if you haven't read that research, if you don't know that research, then you're blind to it.
Right, no,
it's not that
sure.
It's not scientific. It is, honestly, anatomy and physiology at its most basic level. And of course, it has an effect on every single process in your body. Yeah. And if you don't think that your breathing has an effect on the state of your mind, get in a situation where you're choking or suffocating.
You're right.
How quickly does your mind turn from peace to panic if you cannot catch a breath for 20, 30 seconds?
Right.
You want to talk about something that will quickly change the state of your nervous system. It's the ABCs, right? Like, this is the primary threat to our existence, right? If we're not able to breathe correctly.
Correct.
We are metabolic organisms. And if you've ever had a near drowning, or you've ever choked, or you've ever had a panic attack and became breathless, you know the fear that not being able to breathe brings into your mind in a moment. Moment.
And panic attacks, as someone that used to have them regularly, and this might be a good segue to get us to be talking about pros and cons in conventional medicine. I came off multiple psychiatric medications at once. I don't recommend that, but I was at a point in my life that I felt like that was my option. And because of that, I started having like a rebound of all of my symptoms that those medications were quote unquote managing, including panic attacks. So I went from having no panic attacks and being completely numb to having daily panic attacks where like I couldn't breathe and I felt like the world was caving in on me and like I had this tunnel vision. And it was so profound. And the exhaustion that came with having like, you know, what seemed like an hour but was probably only about a minute or two of a panic attack. And it just destroyed my energy levels for the day.
Oh, of course.
Because it was so overwhelming, and that fear of like, I'm going to die, I'm going to choke and suffocate, I'm not going to be able to come out of this.
Yeah, because your body mobilized its fight and flight response. You mobilized all of your energy stores so you could fight off the saber-toothed tiger or run from it.
Right.
And then once the episode was over, your body had to recover from that and build its stores back up, and so you metabolically go into a metabolic trough.
Right,
where you feel fatigued and you have to rest so that you're prepared for the next threat.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So on one hand, conventional medicine has some pretty good tools that are like, you know, relatively helpful for some conditions. And some people, like I have a good friend of mine, and she was like, there was me before Wellbutrin and there was me after Wellbutrin, and it was a different person. And like, I don't hear those cases very often, but listening to her story, I'm like, damn, I'm really glad that, you know, you took that step to get the help that you needed.
Yeah, so let's talk about the strengths, because I think we've kind of flirted with a lot of the inconsistencies, the gaps, the holes, whatever, in the conventional model, right? But there's strengths as well.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the zoo metaphor. Okay. Well, yes, root cause thinking as a naturopath, like to really get to the root cause and change all this, we need to completely change our society and our relationship with our environment and our relationship with each other. That's not something you can write on a script pad.
It's not going to happen overnight.
That's not going to happen overnight. And it's a conundrum of how do we even begin to walk ourselves back towards a healthier life in this crazy world that we've created, especially whenever that world profits some so disproportionately that there's a vested interest in keeping things as dysfunctional as they are.
Right.
That's a whole nother issue. So let's just acknowledge the fact that that ain't going to happen overnight. So the panda in the zoo. Should the panda be in the zoo? Probably not. But it is in the zoo, so when it develops illnesses that would have never developed in the wild, it still deserves treatment. Right? If it picks up, because it's not, you know, in Sichuan province, but in Washington, D.C., if it picks up an infection that it would have never encountered in the wild, like, veterinarians still need to treat that panda to keep it alive. It still deserves to live even if it's not in a healthy environment. Right? So the great thing is that we do have these pharmaceutical options for people, especially that are in acute illness or dysregulation. Somebody who is acutely suicidal, someone who is having so many panic attacks that they can't sleep, they can't function. You know, somebody who is having a psychotic break and a psychotic episode, something like lithium carbonate.
Someone who's a danger to themselves and others.
Right. So, you know, like, thank goodness. I am not by any means anti-pharmaceutical.
Nor
I am not. And I lived for over a decade in an environment with no access to conventional Western medicine. And I'll tell you, it's a pretty bleak reality.
Yeah.
It was a pretty bleak reality, and I know what it's not like to not have access. But we have to acknowledge it for what it is. It is a acute remedy to deal with the fact that we are all living in an unhealthy and contrived environment, and we need some help to be able to survive. Just like an astronaut needs a spacesuit to survive in space, because it is an environment that a human being should never be in. Our body is not built to exist in the vacuum of space. Our bodies are not built to exist in this social environmental vacuum that we've created. right? So we need some extra help and support sometime to be able to actually survive this crazy world we now live in, right? But we can't kid ourselves and say that it's a cure.
Right.
Even psychiatric medicine in the conventional model never speaks in terms of cure.
No.
It knows that it is not curative in nature, right? It is not. It's palliative, and it's about symptom suppression and disease management, right? So we have to acknowledge that for what it is.
Right.
Non-curative. It's a artificial crutch to get us through a contrived environment that we now live in.
Right.
But although that sounds very disparaging, right? There's value to that. There's utility,
huge.
there's function, and thank goodness that we have those medications when we really need those. We just can't kid ourselves to say that this is going to be curative or that this addresses the root cause, because it doesn't.
No, so I want to use my brother as an example because I was really anti-medication after my experience, especially with the psychiatric medications. They have some of the worst side effect profiles for some people.
Yes.
I haven't done like a genome, and we'll probably talk about that in a minute, but my brother ended up getting diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder when he was 17, 18. He's a big dude. He's volatile. What I mean by that is he is violent. He's aggressive, and because he's on the spectrum, he has autism spectrum disorder, he doesn't understand social norms.
Right.
So, for example, one of the things...
And for a social being,
right,
that's your survival strategy, think about what a threat it is to not be able to understand the vibe of your social environment.
right. So,
and then think about how aggressive and irritable that makes you.
100%. Like
Yes.
I feel so much for, we talk about kids with autism, but we don't ever talk about adults now that go into the world, or like the adults that like have a little bit of extra mental health challenges like my brother does. And unfortunately the system doesn't really work, and because of his volatility and his drug use and all of these things, it makes it difficult to try and help someone like that. And there are, systems that give an attempt. But one of the things that gets him in trouble is like, kids are picking on him. Even still today, children pick on him, and he goes to moon them, but he forgets to pull his pants up before he turns around. So now he has committed a sex offense inadvertently. Right? And he didn't realize that that's not was his intention. But because of his volatility, he needs to be on medications.
Right.
He was on, I don't know that he's still using it. It's been a little while since I've connected with him, but like an injection that lasts, I want to say was Halitol.
Okay.
An injection lasts 28 days, and it gives him Parkinsonian-like symptoms.
Okay.
But it's the only medication I have seen make him go from like aggro to, I can manage to be around this person because I'm not worried that he's going to punch my door down, right? Like the violence, he was the person that made me realize sometimes people need to be on medications, and he can't help himself with some of these things. Like there's more to the story. Again, there's complexity and nuance to this.
Yeah, so let's talk about ADHD medications, right? And I have seen people, just like you mentioned, I have seen people that certain ADHD meds have been a game changer.
Oh my gosh.
It has helped them to be able to navigate this environment in a way that, like, they were previously dysfunctional, now they're functional and they can survive. There's a value, there's a utility to
100%.
that. Absolutely. And I've also seen a lot of people fail serially 3, 4, 5 ADHD medications and have extreme, insufferable side effects from those.
Yeah.
Those are both possibilities.
100%.
One medication that I think has a very high side effect and risk profile associated with it is Adderall. And it is one of the most commonly prescribed medications and the most abused pharmaceutical. Right,
I know a lot of people when I was in college that like they were just doing it to get work done, and my college roommates, like, they didn't really get a lot of work done when they were doing Adderall. I'll be honest with you, because I heard them up all night while I was sleeping for my test the next day. Instead of them preparing for their test, they were up bumping around at night. Yeah,
so let's, Adderall is an amphetamine. It is a cousin to methamphetamines. And you think about the profile of somebody who's addicted to crystal meth, and you see the same parallels in the side effects with Adderall. Yeah. Insomnia, appetite suppression, weight loss, anxiety and panic attacks, et cetera, et cetera. But the effect that we're going for is that for maybe 4, 6, 8 hours, depending on dosage and extended versus immediate release, all that person is able to navigate this crazy world a little bit more functionally.
Right.
But the cost that comes along with it for most people, insomnia, anxiety, and whatever, appetite suppression, anorexia, etc. Now, let's think about the fact that this is being used extensively in a developing pediatric or adolescent population.
Oh my gosh.
How important is sleep to the developing brain?
Oh my God, critical.
How important is nutrition? All right, what is the effect of anxiety on social function if social connection and social function is your primary survival strategy?
Right.
Right? There are huge costs that come with, okay, like, all right, my kid now can actually sit through school and focus and get their work done, but they're coming home, they're crashing, they're having panic attacks, they can't sleep, and now they're suicidal.
Right.
Right? So we have decided as a society that academic performance is greater than physical and mental health.
Right.
Right? Now, I know a few people, there's like, and this is off the cuff, just, anecdotal.
Right.
So these aren't statistics, but my experience has been about Adderall. 10 to 15% of people get wrecked by it. I mean, truly wrecked.
Yeah.
Very little benefit, all the classic side effects,
Yeah.
and they can't tolerate it. Maybe, 60 to 75%, somewhere in there. They're more functional during the day. They carry some side effects, burdens. It's enough to be tolerable and functional, and it's a messy compromise that kind of works.
Yeah.
But over time, they develop tolerance to it. And then as they develop tolerance, they take more and more. And then at some point, they get to a tipping point where the side effects outweigh the effects,
Right.
the desired effects. But I have seen a smaller population, probably 10% or less of the patients I've seen, that Adderall has been life-changing.
Life-changing, exactly.
Life-changing. They're like, I have a good friend, one of my best friends, who has a true physiological ADHD, and by physiological, I mean it has genetic roots to it.
Yeah.
True physiological ADHD, and once they started Adderall, they could sleep, they could focus, they could function, their mental health improved, their physical health improved. It was just a game changer, all benefits, almost no cost.
Yeah.
But the important thing to illustrate from that is that there is genetic, physiological, neurological diversity, and every body and everybody is different.
Exactly.
So when we plug children into an algorithm to say, here's the first line med, here's the second line med, and you've got to fail 3, 4, 5 meds before you get to the right medications,
Right.
we are disrupting the health of our adolescents during a crucial developmental window, and they are going to have to bear the cost for that for their entire life.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Genomind or other like pharmacogenetic testing.
Mm-hmm.
Why are we not doing pharmacogenetic testing before putting any adolescent or ped on a psychotropic medication?
Yeah. I think it should be required because there is individual biochemical needs. But here's the kickback I hear all the time. Yeah, but generally the population as a whole, like the majority of us, don't have those problems. Well, if the kid is coming to your office and they're being told that they're being a disruption in the classroom, they're being a disruption at home and at their babysitters, which for ADHD to be properly diagnosed, you need at least 2 places, the home and another place for there to be like a diagnosable like
Right.
condition of ADHD.
It has to be a pattern in more than one environment.
Exactly.
Yep.
And so then you get put on this medication and it doesn't sit well with you. Or you have I get the tolerance and now like I need to take more and now I'm being like super rude and snippy to my siblings and I'm really grumpy and I'm on edge and I'm not eating, and maybe you're not eating because the medication is suppressing you, right? Like it's like a constant struggle, and my brother was the same. Like
Yes.
he was put on methylphenidate at age 2. Did you know there's class action lawsuits for stimulant medications causing schizophrenia? Isn't that interesting? We're gonna boom, dopamine, and then what happens when you have schizophrenia? You have too much dopamine, so we're gonna turn it down. Isn't that interesting? So like, coming back to like, this is the pros and cons of it, but there is still a large portion, not a large portion. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a large portion, like 10 to 15%. That's a significant amount of people that have a huge benefit from something like Adderall or Ritalin or what are some of the other ones?
So like Vyvanse.
Yeah, there's a few of them. And but you're saying like some of these kids, they go through like 3, 4, 5 medications before they like end up in one of our offices, and the parents parents are like fed up with like, my kid is still not behaving and I don't know what else to do.
And what happens is the people who stop taking the medicine because of the side effects profiled are labeled non-compliant.
Right.
Right, and so then they get rejected, and then they end up in the offices of alternative practitioners because they have basically been kicked out of the practice of their, because they couldn't tolerate the insomnia, the anorexia, you know, the aggression, the panic attacks, or they develop quick tolerance and they have to have higher and higher dosages, and at some point they get labeled with drug-seeking behavior for one of the most abused substances in the nation.
Right. So this is also interesting too, and iatrogenicity is proper use of medication or procedures and then it causes further illness. So something I see regularly in my practice is women on birth control. And they cause a number of nutritional deficiencies that look similar like anxiety and depression. So now they get put on an antidepressant, which can be used interchangeably as an anti-anxiety or antidepressant, depending on what flavor of psychiatrist or primary care doc you go to. And then we're treating mental health illnesses that are caused from nutritional deficiencies.
Yeah, well, perfect example, and this goes back to the pharmacogenetic testing as well. There are a lot of people who actually, I wouldn't say have a true like aberration in their neurotransmitter pathways, or they're not neurodivergent in a way that produces an ADHD, you know, profile. But actually what they have is an MTHFR deficiency syndrome, and because their body is not able to absorb, utilize methylate B vitamins, which are so crucial in neurological function, right? They're labeled, those folks often end up labeled as inattentive in ADHD because they literally do not have the energetic building blocks for healthy neurological function.
Right.
So I've seen so many people that have had a ADHD diagnosis. We do the testing. They have an MTHFR, you know, homozygous or heterozygous presentation. We treat them with cheap methylated B vitamins.
Yeah, $20 a month.
And what do you know? Now they're able to focus, they're able to function. But that worked for them because that's what their genetic profile was. That doesn't mean you can throw methylated B vitamins at everybody with ADHD and they're going to get better. It's what they needed.
Right.
It's what they needed. And that's why if you do a large-scale study of methylated B vitamins, you're not going to see the majority of people benefit because it was only a select few that actually needed it.
Right.
Because ADHD isn't just one thing; it's a syndrome. It's a cluster of symptoms, right? That could have multiple different causes. It's not just one thing.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Dr. Daniel Amen's work?
Yes. Yeah.
So I really like his framework, and I think it's a good, relatively decent framework. And he, I believe, 5 or 6 different types of ADHD.
Let's see. It's at least 5. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head.
Might
Yes,
have been 7.
it's in that.
Yeah.
I think 7 is.
I think it might have been
7 might be right.
And like some of the forms of ADHD include like a toxicity profile, and like they use some really like fancy technology called SPECT scan of before and after, you know, while the person is at rest and while the person is trying to focus. And so I think they call it the Ring of Fire.
Yeah, there's the Ring of Fire.
The Ring of Fire, and like that's the one that kind of looks like all of them, and that's the one that the person is exposed to a lot of different toxic things. You know, maybe the kid grew up next to some, you know, water plant that was using hexavalent chromium, which is really toxic and got built up in their system or whatever. You know, there's naturopathic doctors are primed to be able to look at these things and consider the environmental components of it as we're talking about. You know, what I really like about the genetic testing, especially when we're talking about people with mental health challenges that don't do well with medications like myself, I ended up with 3 COMT, catecholamine O-methyltransferase genetic variations. So my body has a hard time processing catecholamines, which are the things that make you stimulated, hence the daily panic attacks.
Right.
So my adrenaline,
so you can
my
build up,
noradrenaline.
You can build up your catecholamines, but you can't break them down.
Correct. So I'm like ready to go all the time on edge, like boom, boom, boom. And that totally personality-wise makes so much sense. But I just need a little extra magnesium, a little bit of extra B vitamins, specifically B6. And it made a world of difference. Do I take that every day now? No. Because my body, like that pathway is going again. And so it feels good. And like if I get a little more strung out, I know that I need that extra support again, and then we go. It's like really fantastic to see especially for people that have multi-drug failure. I don't know if there's a specific term for it.
Treatment resistant.
Treatment resistant, exactly. Yeah. Treatment resistant profiles, we get some of these genetic testing done, and it's like, oh, well, this makes so much sense because of this is what's going on.
Totally, yeah. And that's a classic one with the COMT variations. That's something I see a lot, and especially in a panic profile, an anxiety profile. And SAMI, magnesium B6.
Yeah.
I mean, cheap, simple, safe.
I'd rather take B vitamins and a magnesium every once in a while than some of the psychiatric medications I got put on.
Oh, absolutely.
Because of the side effect profile, and maybe I get to be put in that category of like the 10 to 15% that really just don't do well with those medications in general. But it seems like the stories I've heard of people kind of like snapping out of it and saying, hey, I want to take more autonomy over my health, it's been because they've had a negative outcome with taking, usually it's more than one psych med. I very rarely see someone on just one psych med.
It's rare. Also, I would say in 3.5 years of practice, I've seen on less than one handful of times somebody come in and say, hey, you know what? This psych medication has really helped me and I like it and I don't have any qualms with staying on this for the rest of my life.
Fantastic.
It happens occasionally.
Yeah,
it
sure.
does happen. My friend with Adderall is perfect example.
Yeah.
But pretty much everybody I see is like, okay, well this helped and this helped me get through in a pinch, but I can't do this forever.
Right, exactly.
Right, and so they do have their role, but I really think that most psych meds, their role is really in acute dysfunction.
Short term.
To get people back into a range where we can then, in naturopathic terms, begin to do the work at the lower levels of the therapeutic order.
Right.
What I tell people is, this is what I always tell people, I'm not, well, first off, here in Colorado currently, it's not within my rights, my scope of practice to take anybody off of prescription medication. Nope. I'm like, but what my goal is for you is to build you up from the bottom up with the therapeutic order to achieve optimal function naturally so that hopefully one day you no longer need this medication and then you can work with your prescribing physician to begin to taper off of it. But before you try to taper, let's build you up so that you don't have withdrawal symptoms because you never needed the medicine.
Right.
And that's not just a theory. I've seen that work again and again.
Same.
And again and again.
What's really interesting, and I'm not sure if you've seen this, but one of my teachers, Dr. Christy Fleetwood, she is both a registered pharmacist and a naturopathic doctor, and she was one of my close mentors. And she says, let's get people so stinking healthy that they're over-medicated. Did you know one of the symptoms of being over-medicated on psych meds is an increase in anxiety and depression and panic attacks?
And an increased risk of suicidality.
Right, because they're over-medicated, and then what do most conventional practitioners do? More medication.
Let's switch.
Or let's switch you.
Yep.
Right, and it's like, have they even looked at drugs.com and looked at the drug monograph? Are they even that familiar with it?
So, here's some self-disclosure here on this, but I had a real low point in my life in late spring, summer of 2022. And because it was a real low point and I began to have some passive suicidal ideation, I was like, you know what, this is time. And especially having lost my own father to suicide, that hit really close to home. And I was like, nope. I'm like, I'm recognizing this myself. It's time for some help. Yep. I got on an SSRI, and it did flatten me out a little bit and blunt the edges of it. Side effects were pretty significant for me.
Yeah.
And just, it felt like nothing more than a life preserver thrown to somebody off the edge of the Titanic. Right. Which, if you're afloat in the North Atlantic, a life preserver is very welcome, and it was welcome. But I knew almost immediately, I'm like, this is not a long haul solution.
No.
So then later, I did get on Wellbutrin, and I tolerated Wellbutrin much better and benefited from it quite a bit more. But then I continued to do the work and use the tools that I know how to use to do that, and continued to address dynamics in my life that led to that problem in the first place, and got to the point where I began to taper. And like each time I would see my prescribing provider, I would say, okay, I want to step it down again, down again. And when it got to the end, then I was like, okay, like I actually got to the point where I realized that I was feeling more jittery and more anxious on the days that I took Wellbutrin, which is an NDRI, a norepinephrine dopamine reuptake inhibitor. I started to notice like, oh, after I take this medication, I'm actually starting to feel kind of panicky and anxious, right? And I think it's the medication. So I had a few days where I didn't take it anymore, and I didn't feel that on those days. And I was like, okay, well, this is now like the balance has shifted.
Yeah.
So whenever I went back to my psych NP, and I was like, actually now I'm in the zone where, just like you said with what Dr. Fleetwood said, actually this is inducing anxiety, and this is now not helping me anymore, but it is actually sending me in the wrong direction. I'm ready to be done. My psych NP said to me, you are the first patient I've ever had that has ever gotten to the place where they did not feel like they needed medication anymore.
Because you were using naturopathic techniques and tools to help build your system up so you could get off the life preserve.
They were stunned.
Wow.
And they were like, you mean you don't want to like switch your medication? You don't want to do this? You don't want to, and I was like, no. I'm like, I've gotten to the place where I've used, these other tools, and not only do I not need this anymore, but actually taking it is actually now producing a paradoxical effect.
Exactly.
And I'm good. I feel really good. I've worked through, that season of my life, and things aren't perfect, but they're moving in the right direction, and I'm ready to be done, and I don't need this anymore. Yes. I'm better without it. And he was like, all right, well, like basically that's a new one for me. Like, let's, he's like, I'll keep your prescription in the system so that if you ever need it or feel like you need it again, you can come back to it. But if that's what you want to do, he's like, wow. He's like, this is a new one. This is a first for me.
I love it.
Isn't that the first?
That's kind of crazy. What kind of tools is that person using besides psychiatric medication?
Well, few to none.
I work with a really fantastic nurse practitioner, psychiatric nurse practitioner here in town, and we just did a panel on stress, and she echoed very much the same things that are in the principles of naturopathic medicine. And she knows if you're not drinking water, if you're not eating food on a regular, consistent basis, if you're not going to bed on a regular, consistent basis, that's going to affect your mental health. And if you're surrounded by assholes, that's certainly going to affect your mental health.
Absolutely.
So so there is a little, I find that nurse practitioners and PAs tend to be a little more open-minded to working with us alternative medicine practitioners.
Especially nurse practitioners.
Yes.
Because nurses come from a curative model instead of a curative model.
Yep.
So there's even a difference between PAs and NPs.
Yeah.
Whereas PAs tend to be more curative in focus like MDs.
Yeah.
It's been my experience.
I would agree with that. Okay, so pros and cons. We didn't really talk about inpatient, but I think we'll save that for another conversation. We should start talking about the breakthrough, the technology, and like it's kind of weird for me to say like this new technology, like this new breakthrough support system of psychedelic medications, especially for drug-resistant therapy or patients, because it's been around literally forever. And Joe Rogan, I'm a big fan, and he talks about the mushroom and the mankind, like the thing that like blew up humanity was us eating magic mushrooms out of cow poop.
Yeah, so it's called stoned ape theory.
Stoned ape theory, thank you.
Stoned ape theory, yeah.